Scripture reading today is going to be Daniel chapter 3, verses 8 through 15. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony, with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?
Good morning. If you haven't already, I hope you will at this time open to Daniel chapter 3. The scripture reading does kind of end with the question that we're trying to answer this morning. Who indeed is this God that is going to be able to deliver you? And ultimately, that is the ultimate question of our existence, right? Our life here on this earth and our beliefs being here, we profess to believe in a greater being than ourselves, something that is beyond us, that is worth following after, worth serving, and believing that being is capable of delivering us. But I think Daniel chapter 3 is a good story for the sake of us learning what is God like? What is God like in this situation, and really overall for us in regards to how he saves us and how he brings us through these literal and figurative fires that are placed before us. It is good to be back with you again. I do appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you and to see you. And I know I was talking with some of you that I'm still trying to get everyone's name down. And I've got a directory now, so I might know your address and phone number before I know what your name is. But hopefully, just give me some time, and hopefully we'll be able to close the gap there. I've been teaching a class over at Brownsburg, and we've kind of been jumping segments. We started with Joseph, we jumped to Daniel, and now we've just recently jumped to Jesus. And there's actually some strong parallels between each of those three characters. And tonight, specifically, we're going to talk more so about Jesus and starting with a story that originates actually from Daniel chapter 2. So we're going to be kind of talking about Daniel, but more so focusing on Jesus and the kingdom of heaven this evening. But this morning, in a way that's still tied together, we're going to talk about, who is this God that's going to be able to deliver us? And kind of setting the stage for what was just read in the scripture reading in Daniel chapter 3. That takes place after the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has just had in Daniel chapter 2, where he has had the dream of this great statue that has a head of gold, arms and chest of silver, the torso and abdomen area and legs of bronze, and then the feet and kind of the shin bone area was made of iron, and then the feet specifically iron mixed with clay, right? And then tonight we'll talk more so about the stone and the mountain that comes in and is the thing that does away with that statue. But I think it's a fairly easy connection to see when Daniel describes the dream to Nebuchadnezzar and says, hey, by the way, you being the king of this great nation and ruling over it, if you even turn back a page, right, he says, In verse 36, this was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand, and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Now, lo and behold, chapter 3 comes around, and what does this guy do? Well, why stop with the head of gold? Let's just build a whole statue, right? Now, if you're not sure of what cubits are, it equates pretty much this statue being about 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. 90 feet tall. And I think if you just roughly estimate that a building, let's say has 10-foot high ceilings, okay? You're looking at something like a 9-story building there, just made of gold. This grand image. And we don't know necessarily, did the image look like Nebuchadnezzar? Was it representative of some of the gods? Was it a mixture of the two? We don't know, but it's definitely a statue that is quite awesome to look at in its magnitude, and just the fact that it's gold and how precious gold is, shows his wealth and his power, which is what the purpose of the golden statue was for. And repeatedly throughout chapter 3, we're not going to read it all, but it keeps on laying out this command of what the people were supposed to do. And we read it even a couple of times in the scripture reading, right? That, hey, once you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, fall down and worship it. I think it says it 3 or 4 times in that very chapter, like, hey, when this happens, everyone bows down and worships this. All right, so it's setting this stage for this grand statue that's placed before the people, and they're all going to bow down and witness it in all of its glory. And more importantly, the king's glory, right? By translation, it ultimately goes back to the king as well, right? But as tends to happen in the book of Daniel, there's some snitches or tattletales that go to the king and tell them, hey, you put this, this command out there that they're supposed to worship the statue, or later on it's going to be you put this command out there that nobody's supposed to petition or go worship another god other than you, O king. And well, in this situation, they're tattling on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are 3 friends of Daniel's who came from Israel, who were brought up with Daniel. And so they have been turned in to the king by some of the king's advisors or some close to him. So that kind of sets the stage for this interaction here. And the verses we read mainly focus on setting the stage for what I really want to focus on from the lesson. But it's building up, all right, the king knows about them, the king has them before them, and the king lays out this question. All right, let's read verse 15 again. Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, and the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? All right, what a question posed, quite insultingly, right, to them, to these 3 men, all right, and who they have professed to be. And the question, that he's asking, we're going to try and answer in a couple of points, and there's more that we can go into this, and it's a very deep way that we can answer Nebuchadnezzar's question here. But I think the first way that we can see the kind of God who would deliver them is the kind of God whose servants honor him like these 3 men do. If you jump back a couple chapters, jump back to Daniel chapter 1. If you kind of glance over that, and we're not really going to read all of that, but that sets the stage for Babylon has taken over Judah, has destroyed Jerusalem, and has taken hostage the people, which kind of ends, which is where, first, second Kings, and the lineage of the kings kind of takes a break from ruling over Israel to where now they're enslaved, right? And that's where it picks up in verse 1, where Jehoiakim has been, kind of captured and taken over, and Babylon comes in and besieges Jerusalem and takes things from the temple and those such things. But then in verse 3, it really shifts quickly from that transition of power from Judah to Babylon, and it focuses on King Nebuchadnezzar bringing up these wise men and these people that are going to be in close proximity to him and be working for him. And he's giving them this regimen of, like, all right, how is this going to work? And if you kind of are glancing through there, he starts talking about, hey, we're going to teach them every sort of literature and every type of wisdom that we have possibly amassed and give it to them to make them, as capable and as instructed and knowledgeable as possible. All right, and we're going to give them the best kinds of food. It's going to be food from the king's own storehouses. It's the king's food, which it's the best of the best. Choice food and wine, which they can drink. All right, and they'll be educated for 3 years. And after that, they're supposed to be put into the king's service. And then you jump down to verse 8, where Daniel, along with these 3 men, all 4 of them have been selected from Judah to be a part of this so-called internship, let's call it. And Daniel says here in verse 8, Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths whom are at your own age? Then he would make me forfeit my head to the king. And Daniel responds to that, saying, hey, I'm not trying to get you killed or anything like that. Because obviously, if Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or as they are more properly should be known as Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, as the 3 of them are joining with Daniel, basically the issue is, hey, we don't want to take this food, and we could debate, on forever about, was it because the food was itself, they couldn't have it, or was it because it was food that was sacrificed to idols, or what was the reason? They don't really even go into the reason. Daniel just basically says, hey, we don't want to defile ourselves. He doesn't say why they thought that would be defiling, all right? Because he does talk about giving them wine to drink, and we know that Israel, they drank wine, so that wouldn't have been the issue. But for whatever reason, there was something a part of that these 4 men would not be willing to defile themselves for the sake of following this regimen that would have been the best of food, the best of options, and instead say, hey, why don't you give us vegetables, all right? Everybody's dream diet of just straight vegetables. That's the way to do, and that's how we're going to gain weight and look, healthy, right? Because everybody nowadays eats vegetables to gain weight, right? That's how we do it. And so naturally the commander of the officials is like, oh, this isn't going to work. I'm worried because if I don't, follow you guys through on this regimen and it fails, I'm going to be the one to pay the price. But they say, hey, give us vegetables, give us water, things are going to work out. And lo and behold, they do. In fact, those 4 men looked, plumper and fatter, it says, than the rest of the other youths who are on this, fancier, more expensive regimen of food. And so God delivers them in this situation. But the story isn't, I'm not giving you that story to talk so much about the food and all that stuff. But really that story shows that these 4 men from the get-go, despite getting into this prime placement of an internship, if we want to call it that, with the king, we already see their rejection to just fully assimilating back into this Babylonian culture. Even though it would have been so easy, right? Hey, they getting a pretty nice gig considering they just got enslaved, all right? Now they're going to get the best food, they're going to get the best wine, they're going to get this prime placement and work for the king, get to learn all these new things from all the knowledge that the Chaldeans had collected. And yet we see already hey, we're not going to defile ourselves in the way that we eat, but more so, we're not going to give over our identity to your so-called authority in this matter. And that's the important point to pick up from chapter 1, because that's what's translating here in chapter 3. So if you jump back to chapter 3 and you see, okay, well, what have these men already displayed for us? Well, they displayed that in chapter 1, hey, it would be easy for us to just kind of, hey, they didn't have to go up and curse God or anything, but, just ease into this Babylonian culture. But already they're taking a stand that they're not going to. They're not going to just assimilate. And the same kind of message is very similar with Joseph, right? Despite Joseph going in and being second to Pharaoh, there are times, if you read tiny details, he never got the misunderstood idea that he was Egyptian now. You can even read where it still says Joseph ate separately from the rest of the Egyptians. The Egyptians thought it was, disgusting. It was, looked down upon to eat with the Hebrews. And even in his high position, Joseph ate by himself. When his brothers were there, it said he ate, and then his brothers were eating, and then the Egyptians were eating all separately. All right, so Joseph did not fully assimilate into the culture of the Egyptians. All right, he maintained his connection with God's people. And so now we jump to chapter 3. All right, and we see that these men have already displayed themselves as, hey, we're going to stand up for our nation, our culture, our heritage, which is being the people of God, even in difficult times. And so when we pick up, it makes sense why we're reading and saying, these men have already shown this, and now we're seeing their character on display again. So that kind of transitions us to the second portion of the passage that we haven't read yet, but let's read starting in verse 16. Let's see how they respond now in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Now, I brought up the point earlier about the names, right? Why would they change these men's names, right? We always refer to Daniel as Daniel, right? But there are times in the book of Daniel where he is referred to as his Babylonian name, which is Belshazzar, right? He's only referred that way when it's from the point of view or the character is a Babylonian character or a focus point, all right? Because they wanted him to assimilate. They were changing him, all right? When it maintains the focus on Babylonian characters, or when Nebuchadnezzar is kind of the author of writing in some senses, right? Because we'll get to a point in chapter 4 when he's talking about his dream with the tree, where it's a lot from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view. So it makes sense, and even in this situation, he's interacting with these three men. So he's not going to call them Azariah, Mishael, and I always forget the third one. This is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm still working on that, right? But it makes sense why he'd call them by their Babylonian names. He's in his mind, they are assimilated. They are Babylonian. They are his subjects. But notice verse 16, right? What they just said is completely worthy of execution if you said this to a king. And not just to a king, right? Because Babylon is the world power at this time. They are the dominating force at this time, which is why it makes sense that in the dream in chapter 2, they would be described as the head of gold. You wouldn't describe that kingdom as the head of gold, and God wouldn't be described as giving them over these things and giving him everything that he wanted and pursued if it was a rinky-dink little, kingdom that really didn't have much power, right? They are an awesome, powerful, wealthy nation. And these men, all right, who are completely, in physical terms, in total subjection, totally limited to doing whatever he says, so their lives are going to be forfeit because of it, they literally respond with, "We don't actually need to answer you," right? Which is not something you can say to a king. And I think even keeping it simpler terms that we could all relate to, I've never said that to my parents before. And that's why I'm still here today, all right? All right? If you ever thought of the times you got in trouble with your parents, right? And you just said, where were you? What were you doing downstairs? And you're just like, "I don't have to answer you, Mom. I don't have to answer you." Bad things are about to happen to you, right? And so think about expanding that to where the person who can literally end your life with just a snap of his fingers, you basically tell him, "We are under no obligation or authority that requires us to respond to your question." Which is the whole point of his question, right? In verse 15, "What God is there to deliver you out of my hands?" Basically saying, you have no power here. You are completely subject to whatever I say is going to happen. And their immediate response is, "Nope, No, not at all. Not at all. We're not subject in any way to your authority in this matter. We don't have to give you an answer to this question, this condescending question, right, that is saying that our God is incapable of delivering us. So at the same time, he is disrespecting these three men, but he's mainly disrespecting them because he's disrespecting their God, right? That's how they feel so wronged and disrespected, is because he's spitting, looking down upon, degrading the God of the universe. The very God, funny enough, ironically, in chapter 2, has given Nebuchadnezzar everything he has. Hey, all this power, all this success, all this glory that you've received, it's from God. He's the reason you are, quote unquote, the head of gold. You have this power and wealth and might. It's all been from God. And now, the next chapter, he's insulting that God. He's degrading that God in what he's saying to these three men. So that's kind of part of it, right? These servants are honoring him, honoring this God by the way that they have not assimilated to this culture, by the way they respond to this king. And I think along with that, we've already seen the ways in which God has displayed himself as sovereign throughout this. That's kind of a common theme going throughout, the book of, Daniel, and then even talking about certain characters like a Joseph, where there's captivity and people in other nations. The main theme that really shows up a lot is how God is really the sovereign ruler and in control. That's a really common theme throughout Daniel and Joseph, where you have stories of characters who are in foreign nations, subjected under other rulers. But really, it's a story about how God is ruler over all. And so those 2 points are kind of connected. The fact of the servants honoring him, but also maintaining that perspective that God is the sovereign ruler in this situation. And if you read in chapter 2, 36 through 38, it talks about God's sovereignty in creating this kingdom for Nebuchadnezzar. And then chapter 4, verse 14 through 17, once again talks about God's sovereignty in terms of having the ability to strip things away. And if you don't mind, let's turn just one page, because it should be about a page away. Let's just read verses 14 through 17, chapter 4, because it's pretty awesome story here, talking about the dream, the second dream Nebuchadnezzar has about the tree, right? This grand tree that's going to get chopped down, and all of its stuff's going to be stripped away. And in verse 14 and 15 and 16, it tells us about how you're going to chop down this tree, that this angel of the Lord is going to chop down the tree, strip its foliage, scatter its fruit, and only a stump is going to be left with the roots. And then picking up in verse 16, talking about this man, it says, "Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him." And then verse 17, "This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision of a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is the ruler over the realm of mankind, and he bestows it on whom he wishes, and sets over it the lowliest of men." I can't tell you how many times my dad has quoted Daniel chapter 4, verse 17. When anybody ever gets onto a rant really politically around my dad, and they're talking about, this representative so-and-so, senator so-and-so, president so-and-so, they're just insane. My dad, it's almost like clockwork. Don't even need to talk to him. He's just basically going to quote Daniel chapter 4, verse 17. It's like, well, the Most High is ruler over the realms of men, and he sets over it in these positions of power the lowliest of men. All right? Basically saying there's no reason, no need to worship these rulers. God's put the lowliest men in those kinds of positions. There's nothing about them inherently that makes them great or beyond us. All right? It's just a position that God has chosen to fill with whomever he wishes. All right? So when we see these stories of characters propping themselves up because, hey, I was made king and I'm no longer just a man, I'm something, like godly or a deity in myself, right? And we saw that even for characters beyond the Bible, right? How emperors and popes and all these other people, like, God has chosen me to be greater than the rest, right? That's a common theme that happens here. But Daniel chapter 4 is basically saying, God can put whoever he wishes in those positions. And in fact, God says in chapter 4, he's put whoever he wishes in those positions and described them even as the lowliest of men. And so that's the description that God's been giving to the people here and he's been telling this to Nebuchadnezzar himself. And still, Nebuchadnezzar's got this, good feeling about himself, still being better than everyone. And even after hearing the dream about how God's placed him in that position of power, a year goes by and already he's back to puffing himself up. And because of that, God chops his tree down. He sends him from his palace, from the world of men, into the wilderness. He grows out hair long like a bird's feathers, and his claws grow, and he no longer thinks like a man. He becomes an animal. All right? And it shows God's power and sovereignty in that. And so that's part of it, right? Seeing God's sovereignty and God's rule. But the second part, I think, and the thing I want to wrap up with here in regards to this story of Daniel chapter 3 and these three men going before the furnace, is the latter half of their response, right? After they talk about them not being in subjection to his authority in this matter, they also say something else, starting in verse 17. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of the blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Verse 17 is a direct response to the king, all right, his question, all right? Verse 16 was basically them saying, we don't have to answer you. Verse 17 is them answering, all right, and saying, we didn't have to do this, but we're going to do this. And yes, our God whom we serve can, and even definitively, they confidently say, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. So verse 17 is a direct response to Nebuchadnezzar's question in verse 15. Verse 18, though, all right, is the last thing I want to focus on this morning in the lesson. It says, verse 18, but even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. All right, verse 18 is the hypothetical situation that could have happened, but because we know the story turns out that Nebuchadnezzar throws them into the furnace, they go in bound, but then they're walking around free, and there's a fourth person in there with them that Nebuchadnezzar notices, and God delivers them, and they don't even have the smell of smoke or fire on them when they come out of the furnace. All right, we know that's how they're delivered, and so sometimes we look at verse 18 and we say, well, that didn't really have to happen. That wasn't a big deal. All right, that was just kind of another response. But I think 18 is actually so much more important, even though it doesn't come to fruition in this passage here. Basically, what they're saying in verse 18 is our God's ability to deliver us, our God's power, our commitment to our God, no matter what happens, is not dictated based on the results of this horrible situation that they're put in. The fact that they are at the so-called mercy of this king, who is threatening to kill them, to burn them alive, right, if they don't bow down to the statue, what they're saying is, you asked us what God is able to deliver you. And we said, our God is able to deliver us. But they're basically saying in verse 18 is, even if he doesn't, our God is still able to deliver us. Our God still is in power. Our God is still in control, right? And that's the important thing for us to know, is that they give these two situations that don't change who our God is, despite the two vastly different outcomes, right? Imagine if verse 18 is what happened. Imagine if God didn't deliver them from the fire and the story was merely they stood up before the king and the king burned them alive in the furnace. These men were telling us, they were teaching us today that it didn't change who God was. The outcome of this situation doesn't change who their God was to them. Who he was as the ruler, who he was as sovereign, who he was as a deliverer. And we take, comfort in knowing, but God did save them. God did deliver them from the king Nebuchadnezzar, right? It's like this ultimate smack into the face of this powerful king. Not only did they get that great comeback of I don't have to answer you, right? And so I almost read that situation of oh snap, they got him, burn, or whatever you want to say, right? And then initially it's and then right after that he tries to kill him and they can't do it, and it's oh yes, we got it, right? And that's why most time this is a story that kids hear in their Bible classes, right? Probably wouldn't be as popular a story in Bible classes if the story ends with them being burned alive, right? We wouldn't be putting pictures of them being burned alive in the furnace, right? We have seen those little pictures or colorings or whatever, or replicas of, the picture of them standing in the furnace, and you can see the 4 outlines of different people standing in the midst of the fire. Like, we like that story. But the truth is that there have been plenty of people who, in situations kind of like this, are on the side of verse 18 more so than the side of verse 17. And the fact is, it doesn't change the deliverance that was given to them. Because there are other characters who, they weren't spared from the fire. Let's jump over to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, please. Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 37, right? We're in the hall of faith now. We're talking about all these characters and mainly about how God delivers them and how they had faith and they trusted God. And a lot of them are just popular characters, right? Popular, well-known characters that we have idolized and we have, believed in and we have used to shape our lives around. But then we get down to like verses 33, 35, and it starts talking about God's delivering them, and then all of a sudden it makes a turn. After it says, women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting the release so they might attain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword, they went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. So we focus more so on the list of those that, the Davids, the Abrahams, right? The Noahs, those that they triumphed. We saw their physical triumph over the world. But the truth is, these men in verse 37, these men and women in verse 37 that are talked about that gave their lives, and the end wasn't comfortable or easy or painless. They are still in this list of faithful people who trusted in God, and it wraps up in verse 39. And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. And so chapter 11 is all these people who went before the culmination of the things they believed in came to pass, right? Before Christ came, before he established his kingdom, and the kingdom we're going to talk more so about tonight. And even if we jump back to Acts chapter 7, right, which is kind of, I think, the exact flip side of the story with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is with Stephen. And if you read verse 54 through 60, it talks about how Stephen is stoned, right? And in the midst of that stoning, right, even though he's not being delivered, there's also this ultimate image of deliverance, right? And I think let's just go ahead and turn there, and we'll kind of wrap up the lesson this morning there. It's such a sad story, and yet it's like it's the ultimate great story at the same time in Acts chapter 7. So in Acts chapter 7, starting in verse 54. So, very similar to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he goes a little bit more long-winded, but Stephen just goes on this long-winded burn for like 20 minutes of just like, hey, you guys are doing all the same foolish, dumb things that your ancestors did. And then when he wraps up, of course, they become angered, right? It says, now when they heard this, they were cut to the quick, and they began gnashing their teeth at him. But being full of the Holy Spirit, he gazed intently into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And he said, behold, I see the heavens opened up and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. But they cried out with a loud voice and covered their ears and rushed at him with one impulse. When they had driven him out of the city, they began stoning him, and the witnesses laid aside their robes at the feet of a young man named Saul. They went on stoning Stephen as he called on the Lord and said, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then falling on his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Having said this, he fell asleep. So this story, right, same kind of scenario, right? Basically, they're angered at him, they're coming before him, and the reason that they kind of have that final immediate impulse is because he makes that statement in verse 55, where he looks up and he sees the glory of God, right? And I see the heavens open up, and I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And then it says, they get so crazy they cover their ears and they charge at him and kick him out of the city and then start stoning him. And I think this is almost like a story of our greatest fear matched with our greatest hope and belief at the same time. I think a lot of us, our greatest fear is the fact of the pain and suffering that can come for doing the right thing, of being a follower of Christ, and maybe it's not to the point of death or things, but just any kind of suffering and pain, whether that's, just insults or isolation because along the way you lose friends because you no longer have the same priorities or same cares as them. And eventually you suffer and you feel some pain because of that, right? You lose people that, hey, I had a connection with them. We got along well, but eventually, we split in the path because they wanted other things and I wanted God. And I think this is like that ultimate story of, I'm really terrified of something bad happening to me, like having to suffer to a great extent because of my faith, but also at the other end, like the great joy of knowing that despite him not being delivered from the stoning, despite him not being spared a physical, painful death, it's still a story of Stephen being delivered, right? Of him seeing that ultimate deliverance in Jesus Christ, sitting at the right hand of God, ruler, sovereign, holding the world up by the word of his power. So it's both of those things at the same time. And it ties right back in with the story from Daniel chapter 3, that Jesus has the power, he's there, he is able to deliver us. And really it's basically saying, what God is able to deliver you in a simple, easy way to respond, the God who has delivered you. Right? We are here because we believe we've been delivered. Right? We shouldn't live that we're thinking like, I hope God delivers me. We're here because we believe we've been delivered. You're baptized into Christ, into the kingdom of heaven, because you believe that is deliverance. Not because you're hoping you'll be delivered, but because you believe it. And we can say it with the same confidence that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the same way Stephen was, is that regardless of what happens, you're confident that God delivers you, that God has delivered you. Through salvation, through the blood of Christ, we've been redeemed, we've been bought back, and now we're saved. And whatever turmoil or issues occur, we're still delivered. It doesn't change the deliverance of God. It doesn't change who God is. It didn't change who God was for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They had the same perspective, whether he delivered them there or he didn't. Same thing with Daniel, whether God delivered him or whether he didn't from the lion's den. But we even see at that point, King Darius, when he's already turned him over, or maybe it's Cyrus, I forget, but when he's thrown him in, like he says, hey, your God's going to deliver you. All right, even he knows at this time, Daniel, your God is going to deliver you, I have no doubt. He still had to throw him in the den due to his decree, and he still had to leave him there overnight, but he knew God was going to deliver him. And we can have that same type of confidence to when people ask us, who's going to make it worth it for you? Who's going to deliver you? Who's going to spare you from the world's hands? God's going to spare us. God has spared us, and that's the message. It's not something that's going to happen. It's something that's already happened. God has already spared us. God has already saved us. And you can say in 1 Corinthians 15, death, which is kind of that ultimate, this is what we're supposed to be afraid of. It has no longer has no victory. It no longer has any sting. It's already been conquered by Jesus Christ in the grave. So, you guys won, right? We won. We're on the winning team, and I think in a funny way, each week it's just another victory lap, right? Where we profess to being a part of the winning team, having the right kind of ruler, the right kind of savior that can deliver, that has delivered us. And so we'll meet again this evening to talk a little bit more about that victory, talk a little bit more about that kingdom that kind of ties in here. But this is kind of starting out with, all right, this God has delivered us, and I think this evening we'll talk a little bit more about the kingdom and the importance of that coming and what that meant and the imagery that's given there, but that's kind of the precursor for this evening. But whatever your situation is this morning, I hope that you are a part of the kingdom of heaven. I hope you have given yourself over to Christ. And if you have and you've stumbled and you've struggled with things, God continually, provides us the opportunity to reach back out to him. You have the brothers and sisters here to reach out to and to pray with and to seek encouragement from. Because it's not always easy, it's not always smooth sailing, but God has given us blessings to endure the struggles and difficulties of life. And if you're someone who has yet to put on Christ and you're considering it, or maybe you've not considered it and you've not given much thought to giving your life over to God and to Jesus Christ, it is the greatest decision you will ever make. And I think if you asked several people in here, I think if you asked everyone in here who's made that decision, they will tell you the same thing. And so find encouragement in one another and be there for one another and pray together and support one another through these times in whatever situation you may be. Jesus Christ extends the invitation to you. If you have any need of these things, please come forward while we stand and sing this song for your encouragement.